Who gets remembered in academia? And who quietly disappears from the archive over time? When you write a paper, give a talk, post on Substack or another social media platform, you are participating in a much greater conversation. The question is not only what you're saying, but also whose voices have inspired your work and made your work possible, and whose work you are helping to amplify. Today's episode explores the politics of citation and why crediting others matters, especially in today's academic landscape. I'm joined by two incredible scholars, Doctors Miroslava Chávez-García and Alexandra Mina Stern. Miroslava, or Miros as she goes by, is a returning guest of the podcast. She's also my co-author. She's a femtor. She's a friend. And I must credit her for suggesting this brilliant topic. She's a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and holds affiliations in the departments of Chicana and Chicano studies and feminist studies, as well as Iberian and Latin American studies. She's currently a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Alexandra Mina Stern is a professor of English, History, and Society and Genetics and the Humanities Dean in the College of Letters and Science at UCLA. She earned her PhD with a focus on the history of science and medicine at the University of Chicago. She has published several award-winning books and over 50 articles in a wide range of journals. She often teaches in the areas of science studies and health humanities. In this conversation, we unpack how citation functions as a form of power, how senior scholars can intentionally uplift others, how hypervisibility can create greater risk in today's academic landscape and political moment, and what accountability and repair looks like when we get it wrong, because none of us are perfect and we will eventually make mistakes, myself included. So let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Miros and Alex. Welcome to the award-winning Grad School Femtoring Podcast, the place where first-generation BIPOC students and professionals can listen in on inclusive grad school stories and gain practical tools for sustainable success. This is Doctora Yvette Martinez-Vu, a certified coach, consultant, author, and speaker. I will be serving as your femtor, providing you with insider knowledge to help you thrive in grad school and beyond. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Grad School Femtoring Podcast. This is your host, Doctora Yvette. Today, we are talking all about the politics of citation and why crediting others matters. My guests today are Doctors Miroslava Chávez-García and Alexandra Mina Stern. We're going to dive straight into the questions. So the first question that I have for both of you is, when you hear the phrase, the politics of citation, what does that mean to you in today's academic landscape?
I can go ahead and start. It means really an awareness of one's foundational training and the contributions that have enabled, let's say, an early career scholar to do the work they're doing and to make the interventions they're making. I think that it's important to recognize we want to de-fetishize, in some sense, citations and view them more as, this is a village, a community that has often done the work and lifted up the work. I guess for me, it's really about awareness, and it's about not just taking it for granted or not thinking about it, but being intentional about how do we cite, who do we cite, and what does it mean? What does it mean for whose work is recognized and whose work is elided? We know that really important work can easily be elided because it is not made visible. Let's say we're talking about an article or a book. In the narrative part, in the textual part, also in the endnotes or the footnotes. And both of those are important. And also be thinking about what you're doing with both the narrative and then the endnotes or the footnotes. So I think awareness is first and foremost, and then what are the politics behind who is being included?
Yeah, I love this question. I wanted to actually go back a little bit and first think about this part. So what is it we mean by today's academic landscape? The only thing I can compare it to, at least within, I won't say my lifetime, but in this century, like thinking about the 1950s and the intense pressure that was happening around the fears over communist infiltration and red baiting that occurred in Hollywood among academics and intellectuals, in some ways that they were essentially persecuted and jailed and so forth. And really their lives were upended, right, in so many ways. And because of those fears that were spread throughout the United States. I think it's the closest thing I can compare it to with today, given the intense pressure from the government right now to weed out woke culture, woke education, and given the kinds of scrutiny and the heightened attention to what everyone is saying and doing and thinking. I think we need to be extra careful when we are thinking about in terms of who we cite and when we do and how we do it, when we want to cite those folks that haven't been elevated, perhaps maybe double checking with them to see if it's okay to put them out there, their voices or their identities, because that could be something that is unique to this particular moment that I think wasn't just a few years ago.
I really appreciate that point because, you know, especially with us being quote unquote senior scholars, we need to protect our colleagues where appropriate. And in this kind of very hostile moment, we don't want to create a situation where people are vulnerable or could be attacked. We're in a tough moment because if we want to elevate BIPOC scholars or minoritized scholars, depending on also where they are, you know, that could make them hypervisible. So it's that kind of tension between not wanting people to be invisible for sure, but also not wanting any kind of hypervisibility that is going to lay people out to dry or something like that. This conversation would have been different even like 2 or 3 years ago, but right now we're in such a fraught moment that we have to be mindful of that.
I really appreciate both of your takes on this because I was thinking about this idea of the power that comes with citing others. And then at the same time, I'm glad that Miros, you mentioned, well, let's actually talk about today's academic landscape because it's not even the same as it was just a few years ago. And you're like referring back to even the 1950s. Like right now, we're living in times where we don't just have to recognize and acknowledge others, but that hypervisibility, as you mentioned, Alex, can make some individuals more vulnerable than others. I'd like for you to share a little bit more about this idea of how power functions in academia when it comes to how we cite others. Who tends to be centered in these conversations? Who is left out and erased? And even who is most vulnerable today?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that. I came to the realization that citations are really important because they function as a form of power. But I think in the end, for me, is that they recognize value and worth in many different senses, right? As somebody who is a full professor, credit somebody, I'm validating their work. That kind of sounds messed up in some ways in the layperson's, who am I to bestow power? But the institutional context gives me that power. And so I need to recognize it and not just say, oh, no, we're all the same, which is not true, right? Because I've seen it work out when I've been in review committees and other things, when I see how people talk about each other, about their colleagues, about people in different ranks, like a dean versus a faculty versus a junior person. There are differences, and that is clearly seen. I think it's important to recognize the impact. So for someone like myself, if I don't credit somebody who's more junior than I am, and that's within the academic context, or even think about it outside is even more of an impact, then I'm not recognizing that person and robbing them of their labor, of who they are, of the work that they've done, and the recognition as well. So those folks are left out of these scholarly conversations, and these usually tend to be less known authors or perhaps newer scholars coming on board, graduate students, even undergraduates, and as well as more marginal members of our society, right? The people with intersectional identities, I would say, including poor, racial, and ethnic minorities, women, disabled people, and LGBTQ folks.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because I'm often thinking about this in terms of this is fem mentoring, the kind of mentorship that I have hopefully provided well to many undergraduates and especially graduate students who are working on their dissertations. And often they're building on scholarship and challenging that scholarship. And sometimes they're challenging, let's say, the more staid or conventional readings of certain things. And so they need to mention those works because they're engaging with them. That's important to do that. At the same time, how has their critical formation been achieved? How are they providing, like, let's say, a queer critique of color of something? So then clearly they need to cite whoever has helped them develop that framework. And that could be from monographs or edited collections. It also could be from journals. Let's just say like feminist journals that are not as likely to be cited. And so again, I think it comes back to this issue of awareness and really thinking about what are you pulling into the citations. And, there is sometimes with those who in the early career, they want to have an original argument. We all want to have an original argument, but your original argument is often informed by other original arguments that people have made that we need to credit as well. When thinking about how to really recognize those and to be gracious, I think it's really important to be gracious, whether you're challenging or even like attacking a certain argument or perspective on something, and also when you're drawing from, let's say, an ensemble of different kind of authors and writers and things like that. For me, at this point, I'm happy to lift people up and elevate them, and that's what we have done in the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab with thinking about the politics of citation, and I can talk more about that. I like the theme for this podcast because I think this is a really important part of our mentorship of graduate students and undergrads, but particularly those who will be getting their work out there in some format, in some venue, be it a scholarly journal, be it, something that's more of a web-based or a digital format. I mean, no one ever talked about this when I was in graduate school. And now, over time, we become more aware of it, and I've become more aware of it as someone who's been involved in American studies, ethnic studies, and really thought about kind of minoritized literatures, which are sometimes not published in, if you think about academic books, they're not published by the big prestigious presses. And I remember when I was chair of American culture at Michigan, I was often having to provide a whole paragraph of context of why this particular series, published in what would be considered a second tier kind of university press, was so valuable because it was the premier hub for doing American humanities or something like that, because otherwise people would just dismiss it. Some of the other reviewers would dismiss it. So I also have that take of like, who is reviewing material and how do you need to provide context for citation and for where things are published when there is such a hierarchy of recognition.
I'm so glad that I have you both here to touch on this topic because you really both emphasized the importance of thinking about those who came before us and those who are coming after us. And I will admit that when I think about the politics of citation, I often think about that awareness that you mentioned, Alex, of, well, what are the contributions that allowed you to get to where you are today? What are the frameworks? What are the ideas that inform your own thoughts and your own research and writing? But then also, I appreciate that both of you find it just as important to lift others up and to credit others, especially junior scholars or individuals of more marginalized backgrounds. We're thinking about, at the same time, recognizing today's landscape and recognizing the politics of the power and vulnerability, et cetera. But then you also mentioned, because talking about today, Alex, you mentioned the digital formats that are available nowadays. And I would love to hear your take on this, both of you, your take on social media, on spaces like Substack, because I often wrestle with this myself. Like, to what extent do I need to be citing, crediting others when you're publishing an informal blog post, for instance? I'm curious about these spaces, about Substack and any other social media platform. How does this impact, if it does, citational practices and accountability? What are your thoughts on it? What are your recommendations when someone is considering bringing their own ideas and research to a more public venue?
I think that basically the same general tenets hold in terms of awareness, recognition, engagement with the relevant scholarship. Obviously, a Substack form or a form that's written more quickly and a shorter kind of essay or contribution, I would say might not need the same level of scrutiny when it comes to these questions of citational politics, but I think the general awareness is there. And then with the added caveat, if that's the right word, that this could reach a larger audience because thousands, millions of people are reading Substacks. They're following folks on Facebook, on Instagram, on whatever. That's how many of our colleagues have gotten their dialogues going on in these spaces. And that's often how people are getting news of their own work out there. So one of the people I was thinking about as we were talking is the activist and performer Aluk V. Menon, who is just constantly out there in conversation and kind of making a space for queer joy. And he does these book readings. And so I know he read my book because I saw it and someone sent it to me, but it's not about my book. It's the fact that he's read all these books actually in the history of science and medicine because he's really interested in how queer, non-binary identities and also anything related to gender politics has been taken up in the history of science. And he does these book reports, which are actually really great because it's like 8 slides on Instagram where he summarizes the key themes in these books. I admire what he does. And that's a kind of citational politics that's reaching millions of people. Otherwise, no one would know about these books. So that is one example. If you're doing things on social media, there are some positive aspects to it, but people can do it too hastily. And then they can post things and they can end up having to remove them because it's also things can be read and things can be twisted in social media in so many ways. So you have to treat it with a lot of care and caution going into it. In terms of Substacks or blogs, there's such a wide spectrum, but overall, I'd say the same rules apply. And just be aware that anything you put on social media could go viral within a nanosecond. So you need to be really careful about what you're saying in general. And if someone is going on the full-on attack against someone because they don't like their interpretation of something, it's probably not going to end well.
And also, I was thinking sometimes we don't always get these things right. Like sometimes we mess up. And it's happened to me where I've overlooked things. I think the best you can do is to address it. There's different ways to do that. You can do it publicly, or you can even check with those folks that you didn't. Not everybody would want to do that, but that's something you can do. And hope it's resolved and be able to move on. I think it's important to move on and learn from it, but not dwell on that aspect because it happens to all of us. Because if we did that all our lives, we would never move forward, right? In terms of looking at all the literature, so much that comes through. But you want to do due diligence and feel that if I miss something, you hope one of your colleagues who's reviewing your work can point that out to you.
So much came up from this conversation, but what I picked up is the same level of awareness is important when you're sharing information publicly online, whether it's social media, Substack, or any other public space. Although, like you said, Alex, the level of scrutiny may not be the same, but you never know when something might go viral. You never know when something might be misinterpreted. You never know when you might mess up. And like you said, Miros, there's an opportunity for repair. And also, I like that you mentioned the relational aspect of things, that as you work on anything that you share, whether it's a more formal publication or something more public and less formal, you can always lean on your community and hope that someone will be able to point that out. That's also just something to keep in mind for any type of public information or publications that you work on. If you're navigating grad school or supporting students who are, I want to take a moment to share something I've designed with you in mind. I offer interactive, culturally responsive workshops on grad school admissions and sustainable productivity, created specifically for first-gen, BIPOC, low-income, neurodivergent, and non-traditional students. These sessions go beyond the basics. I cover topics like writing compelling personal statements, securing funding, overcoming burnout, and building productivity systems that actually work for your brain, body, and circumstances. If you're a student, consider passing this along to your program director. And if you're a program coordinator or advisor or director listening in, I understand the constraints you're facing because I've been there as a former program director myself. That's why I partner with institutions of all sizes and work flexibly within your budget. You can learn more at gradschoolfemtoring.com/speaking or view my sample videos and testimonials on my Talkadot speaker profile. We can close the hidden curriculum gap together, one workshop at a time. So now I'm actually thinking about how both of you have been involved in collaborative work, co-authored work, and I'm curious what acknowledgement looks like because you both are senior scholars. And so what does that look like when you're lifting up early career scholars or BIPOC scholars?
Yeah, I can give a pretty concrete example, and I appreciate that Miros has brought in some concrete examples, like looking at style guides and, how they're having to keep up with an ever-shifting landscape. So it is good to look at them for guidance. I founded something called the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab that I still co-direct with two other scholars, Nicole Novak and Natalie Lira. And we're kind of in a hiatus now because we were not renewed under the Trump administration for our large funding that we had received from NIH from a special program on the ethical, legal, and social implications of the Human Genome Project, which allowed us to do work and was really moving in the direction of thinking more critically about issues of justice and genetics and ableism, and they were doing a lot of interesting work, and that came to a complete standstill, and we're kind of in that standstill with that general perspective. But, one of the things that was really important when we founded the lab was, first of all, we all worked on the name of the lab together. So it's not like I just decided what it was because I was the senior scholar and was the one who was kind of in charge and the PI and all of that. We talked about many potential names, and we landed on that one because we felt like it encapsulated both the focus on sterilization. We didn't put forced sterilization because sterilization is complex, particularly when you look at communities that have had sterilization forced on them, but have had reduced access to kind of contraception. So there's two sides to it. And then the social justice was really to elevate the fact that we were thinking about this through a social justice reproductive lens, and that it was a lab insofar as we were working on research problems together and thinking them through together. And we really set the lab up as a feminist collective guided by the ethos of shared work, of supporting each other. And we did things like we developed guidelines for, let's say someone wanted to do a research project based on all the data we had, what we gathered in the lab. We had a protocol for how it would be proposed, how we would review it together, how we would decide on, most of these were co-authored on authorship lineup. And I almost always would be, as is often common in the sciences, which is interesting to think about, the final author is kind of the senior person. And then the person who took the lead, which often was one of the early career scholars, would be the first author. And then we kind of figure out who was doing what. But the idea really was to lift up. It was really important for us to support the early career scholars in getting their work out there, in being the first author in an article that would appear in the American Journal of Public Health or publish something in the Journal of Family History. That was a co-authored piece I did with someone. So that was very intentional. And we spent a lot of time talking about that because we developed the protocols together with that in mind. We never had fights or tensions about it because we all agreed on the general principles. I really like that. It was built into the lab and what we were doing with all of the research materials. But I think it's really important if you're going to do collective work with someone, you need to figure that out ahead of time. It's not an afterthought. What is the politics of this? And also, who needs to be elevated? Who needs to step back? These are principles of collective or coalition work. Who's going to step forward? Who's going to step back? Who do we need to elevate here and why? And generally, if you talk it through, you end up at a good place. Now, there could be tensions arise because someone feels like they're doing more work in the end than someone else. We didn't really have those, but at least if you have those guidelines, I think it's really helpful. And I wish that we brought more of that into our academic work instead of just being driven by this more individualistic model or, oh, we'll just figure it out at the tail end. So foregrounding is important.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And actually, Yvette and I had this exact same experience with our co-authored book in terms of doing collaborations. And I was trying to put a percentage on this, like what percentage of that actual aspect of me being able to lift up Yvette was motivating to do the project. But I think it was multiple things. We definitely want to get the word out. Our purpose is mentorship. That was part of it. But also, as well as me, what can I do for Yvette? How can I uplift? I think I've always had this need or desire to help others, partly because people paved the way for me. I would not be here without standing on the shoulders of giants. I don't believe in close the door behind you when you get into the room. And that does happen. And I have seen where senior professors are working with their students and will always put their name first. Then the implication is even worse. You're thinking like, is this professor taking their students' information and passing it off for themselves? It also makes you look a little bit worse. And well, there's a lot of implications, whose name comes first, regardless of alpha order, that kind of thing. In the sciences, it's very clear. At least we think it's clear. Like first person, they go by percentage in terms of second, third, and who did what. I shouldn't make a blanket statement, but that's clear. But in the humanities, because we tend to prioritize the individual and trying to show what did the individual do, the whole work that we de-emphasize collaborative work, where collaborative work can be so much more generative. That is that you're more willing to get things done. And actually studies have shown that you will get more work done if you do collaborations. There is a place and a time for collaboration in the humanities. And I think I'm doing it more now because I'm more senior and perhaps I get more of a pass. And when I was starting out, I think it was a win-win for us to do that project. The book was about mentoring itself. I think we worked with each other sort of equally, and that's been great. And I'm so grateful for her helping me really promoting the project since it came out. That has been all Yvette.
What I'm hearing from both of you is that you're both very intentional about how you work in relation with others, in particular with your collaborative and co-authored projects, but also it sounds like just in general, even in your sole authored work. I appreciate, Alex, that you brought us back to this idea of following the principles of coalition work and that you had a very specific protocol and guidelines because that provides clarity. And with Miros, I appreciate that you were always so intentional about us leaning into our strengths and of us mentoring one another in the process. But just in general, both of you are very, very intentional. And I'm curious because you mentioned, Miros, about the humanities and how, especially as an early career scholar, there's an emphasis on you making sure you publish your own sole authored work. Nevertheless, no matter what kind of work you're doing, there's always influence and there's always someone who is supporting your work. I'm curious when we think about going beyond formal references and thinking about all the many ways that other individuals contribute to our work, whether it's mentors, peers, an assistant, a community member, someone who sparked an idea. How do we acknowledge them? What does acknowledgement look like in practice when you think beyond formally citing someone?
There's so many different ways we can do it. And I really appreciate that question, helping me step back and thinking about it. So first, anytime we speak in public, there's an opportunity, whether we're teaching, giving a formal presentation, at a conference or a talk, or even being interviewed for a podcast like here. I think we have a chance at minimum to say something like Dr. Vicky Ruiz has been very instrumental in shaping my arguments, or Dr. Alexander Stern pointing me to these amazing archival sources, which she did. And then you can just simply say, if you're interested in learning more about them, I'm happy to share more of the research when I'm done or so forth. Or if you remember the name of their books or articles quickly, you can. But at least mentioning their names. Of course, like I said, anytime we write, whether it's formal or informal, we can recognize them in the introduction of our books, or perhaps when you mention them, like for us as academics, we have personal narratives that we write about ourselves and like reviews, you can mention them there as another place to bring to readers' attention. And even when you're reviewing manuscripts and things like that, or papers, and you're like giving a formal review, oh, did you look at this person? Like naming people. And I've seen that done very intentionally. Did you look at these three either women of color or queer scholars or whatever, because the reader wants to make sure that the person who's written this piece is aware of these authors. And of course, social media, I think, is a very place people can credit and recognize other, share their work, acknowledge it, circulate it. And I think that's the best form of flattery and also bringing in recognition. I think being very specific how people help you, that shows that sort of expertise that you're bringing in. It also shows that you care and you listen to them and you actually follow through. I think it's important to also be authentic. I think that's a key point of success in social media, particularly if you're being, at least to me, if you're not being authentic or you're being like just saying it because people want you to say it, just being fake, I think that comes through. So I think it's really important to be authentic to who you are.
Yeah, while you were speaking, Miros, I was thinking about, we all have our unique voice and the way that we speak up and speak out and kind of convey our work. And It is that balancing act between having, let's say, as feminist scholars, a strong voice and hopefully a commanding voice in certain settings, and at the same time, recognizing that we have that because we're part of community and because we have been lifted up by others, and we need to recognize others. It is our voice, but it's part of a collective chorus. So that's one thing I was thinking about. The second is, now I'll put on my hat of being a humanities dean at UCLA, and I don't want to get too boring about dean stuff, but every year I've organized a task force on some topic that's really important to humanities. And last year, our focus was on community engagement and public humanities. So we developed guidelines, which are for the entire division. And I'm asking each department to develop their own field-specific, basically paragraph or framing for how in their field they do community-engaged public humanities work. And that work is often, not surprisingly, public-facing. It's also often collaborative and involves community partners who otherwise might not be recognized, and really providing not only how do we do this and how do we provide the recognition, what does it look like, but also why it's so valuable and important to recognize it. Because we have particularly early career scholars who are doing all these amazing things in communities, at cultural institutions, with creative arts groups, with groups that, let's say, have marginalized identities in and beyond Los Angeles, I mean, across the whole world, really. And that needs to be made visible. There needs to be shown that this is scholarship, this is research. You can't do this without doing community-facing work and all of that. That has been really important to me, and I think that speaks to what some of what Miros was saying. Humanity is often individual voice, individual recognition, and some people will just do their individual projects. If they follow a good practice of citation, that's fine, but there is more and more collaborative work, and I think recognizing that and providing ways of seeing it is important. I agree that there are many ways in which we disseminate, for lack of a better word, our scholarship or our research. And often more and more we do it in PowerPoints, whether it's in person or whether we're doing something online. It's really easy on a PowerPoint to just create a slide that says, thanks to so-and-so, thanks to this peer, this kind of like fellow or sister graduate student, if someone's in graduate school, who pointed me in this direction, thanks to this professor who gave me this, or thanks to this archivist. That is good. It doesn't mean that you don't have individual innovation in the project. It means that you're situating the project in the context of how it was born and who helped to give it legs. And so I really think that encouraging our students and our colleagues to do that and to recognize people and give them shout outs is really important. And I always try to do that. I'm sure, like Miro said, I've messed up and I've forgotten to do things, but it's better overall because we're always part of a scholarly community and we want to be part of that community and to hold each other up. So I think it's really important to do that. And there are many ways in which you can do that. And just thinking about whether it's in a PowerPoint, if you're reading a talk at the beginning of that or at the end of that. So anyway, I just think, encourage people to do that. I mean, don't have it take up 10 minutes, but you can do it quickly.
You're both reminding me that there are so many ways to credit others, and at the same time, there are so many things to consider when you credit others. Just to go back to this idea of what do we do when we mess up? What do we do when we fail to give proper credit? I'd love to hear your takes on this. Like, how can we take responsibility and make amends? And what can repair look like? Because none of us are perfect and we will mess up at some point.
This goes back to a point we were getting at in terms of how do we teach our own students to do that? Yvette knows, Alex as well. I was the faculty director of McNair Scholars Program, and our students are really good about doing that. Their presentations in the summer that they gave, I have a whole slide just of all these people, and I thought, wow, that's really heartening to know that the young people are really doing that. I think some of our lapses sometimes happen because of our training I think that a lot of times when we're being trained, a big area that we focus on is like literature review, right? And so what is literature review? So we just think it's just naming everybody. It's not just about naming people or like knowing that you've read everything that there is to read, but it's really charting those or those people that we're building upon, right? Who are we building on? Who are we adding to? What is this conversation that we're engaging in? I always tell students when we're thinking about literature review, like where our work fits, like think of yourself as going into a cocktail party. Or maybe that sounds old school, but maybe a fizzy water party. But what conversation are you going to join and who's in that circle, right? You want to name those people. Those are people that you're engaging with. And maybe they're at your level, but maybe there's people there who are a different generation and you want to name them as well as they're the ones who are part of it. You're adding a grain of sand to that larger beach or whatever. We're not always taught that when we're doing literature review. We're taught other things about literature review, but we're not really given that sort of consciousness about what it is that we're really participating in and the stakes that are involved with that. I think that when we lapse in that, as I said before, you don't have to necessarily address those individuals, but you can make it a point in your own teachings or in your own talks saying, I want to make sure I recognize this. I may have lapsed in the past. It just depends. We hope that we haven't done something egregious because people do know things, right? That happens because somebody gets hurt, like personally and professionally. Right. And so they're like, oh my God, that person didn't cite me and I'm a junior person. And they'll tell their advisor. And it's a small network. People find these things out. And so I think it's important to make that repair work as quickly as you can and just own up to it. And again, move on and maybe learn from it and teach others about it. It does get out. So I think it's important to do as much repair work as you can.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just second everything that Miro said and say in general, it's really important to approach this to not be defensive and to just reflect and be graceful about it and see what you can learn from it. Because often I know when I was coming up the ranks, so to speak, and getting my work out there, I was a mixture of vulnerable and ambitious and excited about engaging. And I feel like I wish I had had this podcast then, reflect more on these things. But looking back on that, and now if someone were to come to me and say, you really messed up by not citing this person, I mean, A, I might not have known about it, and B, it might have been an oversight. And then I would want to reflect on it and like, what does that mean? Not just like about me also, but about the landscape in which we're sitting, in which certain citational practices are valued over others. And how can we shift the needle on that, wanting to change it and to become more inclusive and referential, especially in terms of lifting up certain scholars. Non-defensiveness is generally a good approach. I would say definitely we should all practice that, and then we'll have more honest conversations too.
I wanted to add one other thing I think we haven't touched on, which is important in terms of what happens when we're not cited. And definitely we talked about you being ignored, or your value isn't being uplifted and so forth. At the same time, your work is erased from the landscape to some extent. For a lot of us who are fortunate to have like tenure track positions, it also impacts your compensation. And that's a huge leap. And this is definitely in the STEM fields where like citations, like how many citations, there's actually a factor, right? Where they look at who's citing and how many times your work is being cited. And that's used at the time you're being reviewed. So for those folks who don't know too much about what happens in academia, when we're reviewed, we look at that. Who's citing your work and where is it making an impact? And if that's not being cited, your colleagues are going to go, okay, this work isn't as meritorious as another piece of work. So that couldn't impact you at the time of your merit. And so that can impact what your salary looks like for the next few years. So that is an impact as well. And also because if you're not being recognized, your work isn't being discussed or elevated, the ideas you might have for community repair work, for instance, might not get out there. So that might impact these communities that you're trying to uplift. So when you're shut down, your work is shut down, those ideas and those people or whatever your, I'll say agenda, your social justice work, and that's what I'll call my work, is not being promoted as well. So there's all these implications behind it.
Definitely a lot to consider, a lot to think about, a lot to learn from. As we get close to wrapping up today's episode, I would love just to hear from each of you. If someone resonated with the episode and wants to learn more about you and your work, how can they do that?
I'm easily found at UCLA. I'm in the English department, the history department, and the Institute for Society and Genetics, as well as in the dean's office. And the Sterilization Social Justice Lab website is still up and active, so people can find me there. It's pretty easy with a Google search, especially if you use my full name. So I'd welcome hearing from anyone who'd like to take the conversation further. Thank you for this opportunity, Yvette. It's been great to talk to both of you, and congratulations, book, which Minos gave me a copy, yay, when she was in LA doing one of her events, because you're very busy, Miros. I don't even remember which one it was. So in any case, thanks for including me.
Yeah, I think similar to Alex, I'm at my UCSB faculty webpage. You can just Google my name, or I'm actually more active now on LinkedIn, and glad to connect with people who are interested. And I feel like we have so much more to say on this topic, but that's okay. We touched on a lot of really important parts.
You know what? I was hoping that we would keep it brief, but clearly there is a lot to say, and there is just so much for folks to take away from this episode. I really, really appreciate you both for making time and space for this conversation. I know it's going to help out a lot of early career scholars. I have a lot of listeners who are college students, who are graduate students, and early career professors, and this is really going to help them. So thank you both. I really, really appreciate this. I am left feeling humbled because there is so much wisdom in this conversation. What stands out to me the most is that citation is not just a technical requirement. It is relational, it is political. We heard that awareness is a starting point, and it starts with thinking about who shaped your thinking. It also continues on with greater awareness of the voices that are often left out, also awareness of how power operates in academia and in other public spaces. We heard that mentorship and collaboration require intentionality. We also need to have more clear authorship conversations, more shared principles, and a willingness to either step forward or step back, depending on who needs to be elevated in any given moment. And finally, we were reminded that repair is possible. When we miss something, we can reflect, take responsibility, make amends, and move forward with greater care. Growth is part of good scholarship. So as you think about your next paper, your next publication, your next presentation, grant proposal, you name it, even if it's a social media post, I want you to pause for a second and ask yourself, who helped me to think this through? Who deserves to be named? Who can I uplift? That's it for today. Thank you for listening. And as always, I'll talk to you all next time. Thanks so much for listening. If you liked what you heard, here are 3 ways you can support the show. The first is to make sure you're subscribed and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. The second way is to get your copy of my free resource kit linked in my show notes. This kit includes tools, worksheets, and curated podcast playlists to guide you through applying to and navigating grad school. The third way to support my show is by joining my email newsletter, where I share key takeaways and additional resources. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.